Chapter 12. Will and Horace both turned quickly to look at her. "Wargles? How do you know?" Will asked. "I've heard them before," she said in a small voice, biting her lip. "They make that chanting sound as they march." Will frowned. The 4 Wargles he and Holt had tracked had made no chanting sound, but then he realized that they had been tracking their own quarry at the time. Out of the corner of his eye, Will saw a movement at the bend in the road. "Get down!" he hissed urgently. "Keep your faces down!" And both Horace and Evelyn dropped their faces into the sand. He reached up and pulled the shadowing depths of his cowl further over his own face, then held a forearm draped in the folds of his cloak to obscure everything but his eyes. The chant, he saw now, was a form of cadence, designed to keep the Wargles moving at the same pace, in the same way a sergeant might call the step for a troop of infantry. He counted perhaps 30 in the group. Big, heavy-set figures, dressed in dark metal-studded jackets and breeches of some heavy material. They ran at a steady jog, chanting the guttural, wordless rhythm, which, he realized now, was nothing more than a series of grunts. They were all armed with an assortment of short spears, maces, and battle axes, which they carried ready for use. As yet, he couldn't make out their features. They ran with a shambling movement in 2 files. Then he realized that they were escorting another group between the 2 files. Prisoners. Now the group was closer, he realized that the prisoners, about a dozen of them, were staggering along, trying desperately to keep pace with the chanting Wargles. He recognized them as Celts, miners judging by the leather aprons and skull caps they wore. They were exhausted, and as he watched, he could see the Wargles using short whips to urge them along. The chanting grew louder. "What's happening?" Horace whispered, and Will could have cheerfully choked him. "Shut up!" he shot back. "Not another word!" Now the Wargles were closer, and he could make out their faces. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck begin to rise as he saw the thick, heavy jowls and noses that had lengthened and thickened almost to the size of muzzles. The eyes were small and savage and seemed to glow with a red hatred as they lashed their whips at the Celts. Once, as one of them snarled at a stumbling prisoner, Will caught a quick glimpse of yellow fangs. He was tempted to shrink down further, but he knew any movement now would risk discovery. He had to trust to the shelter of his cloak. He wanted to close his eyes to those animal-like faces, but somehow he couldn't. He stared in fascinated horror as the terrible Wargles, creatures from a nightmare, chanting incessantly, jogged past the spot where he lay. The Celt miner couldn't have lost his footing at a worse place. Lashed by one of the Wargles, he stumbled, staggered, then crashed over in the road, bringing down the prisoners on either side of him. Will could see now that they were roped together with a thick, rawhide leash. As the column came to a confused stop, the chanting broke up into a series of snarls and growls from the Wargles. The 2 prisoners who had been brought down struggled to their feet under a rain of lashes from their captors. The miner who had caused the fall lay still, in spite of the vicious whipping from one of the Wargles. Finally, another joined the first and began beating at the still figure with the butt of his heavy, steel-shod spear. There was no reaction from the miner. Watching in horror, Will realized that the man was dead. Eventually, that same realization came to the Wargles. At an incomprehensible command from one who must have been in charge, the 2 stopped beating the dead man and cut the bonds that attached him to the central leash. Then they picked up the limp body and threw it clear, hurling it towards the thicket where Will and the others sheltered. The body crashed into the bushes closest to the road, and Will heard Evelyn utter a small cry of fear. Face down, not knowing what was happening, the sudden crashing in the bushes had obviously been too much for her to bear. She bit the noise off almost as soon as it started, but she was already too late. The leader of the Wargles seemed to have heard something. He turned now and stared hard at the spot where the body lay, wondering if the noise had come from the miner. Obviously, he was suspicious that the dead man might be merely foxing in an effort to escape. He pointed and shouted an order, and the Wargle with the spear stepped forward and ran it casually through the dead body. Still, the commander's suspicions weren't satisfied. For a long moment, he stared into the bushes, staring straight at the spot where Will lay, wrapped in the protective camouflage of his ranger cloak. The apprentice found himself staring deep into the angry red eyes of the savage thing out on the road. He wanted to drop his eyes away from that gaze, convinced that the creature could see him. But all of Holt's training over the past year told him that any movement now would be fatal, and he knew that dropping his eyes could lead to a tiny, involuntary movement of his head. The true value of the camouflaged cloaks lay not in magic, as so many people believed, but in the wearer's ability to remain unmoving under close scrutiny. Forcing himself to believe, Will remained motionless, staring at the Wargle. His mouth was dry. His heart pounded at what seemed like twice its normal rate. He could hear the heavy, rasping breathing of the bear-like figure, see the nostrils twitching slightly as it sampled the light breeze, testing for unknown scents. Finally, the Wargle turned away. Then, in an instant, it whipped back again to stare once more. Fortunately, Will's training had covered that particular trick as well. He made no movement. This time, the Wargle grunted, then called an order to the group. Chanting once more, they moved out, leaving the dead miner on the roadside. As the sound receded and they disappeared round the next bend in the road, Will felt Horace moving behind him. "Stay still!" he whispered fiercely. It was possible that the Wargles had a sweeper following, a silent-moving rear scout who might catch any unwary fugitives who thought the danger was past. He forced himself to count to 100 before he allowed the others to move, crawling clear of the bushes and stretching their stiff and aching limbs. Signalling to Horace to take Evelyn back to the campsite, Will stepped cautiously into the road to check the Celt. As he had suspected, the man was dead. He had obviously been beaten many times over the past few days. His face was bruised and cut by the whips and fists of the Wargles. There was nothing he could do for the man, so he left him where he lay and went to rejoin the others. Evelyn was sitting, crying. As he approached, she looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and her shoulders heaving with the great sobs that shook her. Horace stood by, a helpless expression on his face, making useless little movements with his hands. I'm sorry, Evelyn managed to gasp. It's just that chanting, those voices, I could remember everything when they... It's all right, Will told her quietly. My God, they're horrible creatures, he added, shaking his head at Horace. The warrior apprentice swallowed once or twice. He hadn't seen the Wargles. He'd lain there throughout the entire encounter, with his face pressed hard into the sandy ground. In a way, thought Will, that must have been just as terrifying. What are they like? Horace asked in a small voice. Will shook his head again. It was almost impossible to describe. Like beasts, he said. Like bears, or a cross between a bear and a dog, but they walk upright like men. Evelyn gave another shuddering cry. They're vile, she said bitterly. Vile, horrible creatures. Oh God, I hope I never see them again. Will moved to her and patted her shoulder awkwardly. They're gone now, he said quietly, as if soothing a small child. They're gone now, and they can't hurt you. She made an enormous effort and gathered her courage. She looked up at him, a frightened smile on her face. She reached up and took his hand in her own, taking comfort from the mere contact. He let her hold his hand for a while. He wondered how he was going to tell them what he had decided to do.